He just stood there, and the alien couldn't believe it. The night was quiet. Too quiet for a city like New Avalon. Streetlights flickered as a strange hum filled the air. It came from above. A ship, not like any plane humans had seen, hovered silently above a bookstore on 9th Street. The ship was black, sleek, and alive with red energy veins running across its surface. Inside the ship stood General Xelera, a top warrior from the Zelvan Empire. Her armor shimmered in the darkness, her glowing eyes scanning the earth below. Her mission was clear: test human reaction, measure their fear. She landed in a flash of red light, sending a shockwave through the ground. Windows shattered. Cars shook. People screamed and ran in all directions. Panic spread like fire. All, except one man. He stood in front of the bookstore, calm, still, and quiet. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just looked at her. Daniel Carter, a man with tired eyes and simple clothes, stood like a statue. His gray sweater was a little dirty, and he had a book in his hand, as if the noise outside wasn't even worth closing the page. Xelera tilted her head, confused. She stepped forward, her heavy boots cracking the concrete beneath her. Her weapon buzzed to life, glowing bright blue. Her voice echoed through the street, metallic and cold. "Kneel, human." Daniel blinked slowly. He didn't move. Xelera stepped closer. "I said, kneel." Still, no response. His eyes looked straight into hers. Not angry, not afraid, just calm. For the first time in her warrior life, Xelera hesitated. She had fought in 23 battles, crushed enemies with her own hands, and led soldiers across galaxies. But never, never had she seen a creature look at her like that. "Do you not understand fear?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Daniel finally spoke. "I understand it," he said softly. "I've just seen worse than death." His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to challenge her, but it hit Xelera like a wave. She scanned his body. No weapons, no armor, no military signs, just a man, alone, defenseless. But her gut told her something else. This man was not weak. Behind her, drones hovered, recording the scene for the Empire. They expected her to act, to strike, to kill, or to capture. But Xelera didn't move. Her hand trembled slightly. She couldn't understand it. Why was her heart racing? Daniel looked up at the sky where her ship floated. He spoke again. "Is this how you greet strangers on your planet?" Xelera lowered her blade a little. "We are not here for peace." Daniel nodded. "I figured. Most peaceful people don't carry weapons that glow." Silence hung in the air. From the shadows, terrified citizens watched. Some held their breath. Others recorded with shaking hands. No one dared to interrupt. The alien and the man stood only a few feet apart, but it felt like a world was between them. Xelera's breathing grew heavy. She was trained to deal with enemies who fought, screamed, or begged. But this quiet defiance, this calm courage, it was unnatural. She turned away sharply and activated her communicator. A voice from her ship asked for a status report. "Target encountered. No threat detected," she said. "Returning." "What? Why?" "Eliminate him," the voice barked. Xelera paused, her eyes still on Daniel. "There's something strange. I need more time." With a flash of red light, she vanished. The street was quiet again. Daniel looked at the place she had stood just moments ago. He closed his book, tucked it under his arm, and walked back into the bookstore like nothing had happened. In the shadows, no one moved. No one spoke. That night, news spread fast across the internet. An alien warrior confronted a man and left without hurting him. People called him brave. Some called him stupid. But no one could explain it. Why didn't he run? Why didn't she attack? And most importantly, why did one of the galaxy's deadliest warriors walk away? She watched him from the shadows, trying to understand. General Accelera was not used to questions. In the Zelvan Empire, warriors followed commands. Emotions were weaknesses, curiosity was dangerous, and hesitation. It was the first step toward death. But ever since that quiet human refused to kneel, something inside her wouldn't stop moving. Not fear, not anger. Something else. Something she didn't have a word for. Back on her ship, high above Earth's surface, she stood alone in the observation deck. Screens showed footage of Daniel, zoomed-in images from drones, heat signatures, and bio-readings. No implants, no body armor, no cyber enhancements. Nothing special. And yet, when she stood inches away from him with a charged blade at his throat, he didn't blink. How? She whispered to herself, voice low. She didn't report the full encounter to command. They believed the human was unworthy of analysis. But Accelera had a different idea. She had faced elite warriors across 12 systems. None had made her feel like this. She needed to watch him, to understand. And so, the next night, she returned to Earth. Not in full armor, not with her weapon drawn. This time, she cloaked herself in a stealth suit, dark as shadow, quiet as breath. From the rooftops, she followed Daniel. He didn't go far. He walked through cracked sidewalks, past broken vending machines, and into the same old bookstore. He greeted the old man at the counter with a warm nod. They shared tea. No words were spoken. Strange. Accelera crouched on a rooftop nearby, invisible to the human eye. She had seen war councils, interrogations, training drills. But this, two men sipping tea in silence. Why was it? Peaceful. Hours passed. Daniel helped a young woman carry books to her car. He patted a stray dog and gave it half of his sandwich. He sat under a tree and read for a long time, and never once looked afraid. Not even when a group of drunk men threw a bottle nearby, yelling at the sky about aliens and fear. Daniel just watched them pass, calm and quiet. Accelera tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. No training. No weapons, no allies. How does he stay so calm? Back on her ship, she tried to simulate his behavior. She ordered her AI to run thousands of scenarios. What would make a human stand still in front of death? The results were mixed. Some said trauma, others said madness. But one result, only one, said something different. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand anyway. Accelera stared at that line for hours. Her species didn't believe in such things. Fear was a tool. Honor was a myth. But if this human had made a choice to stand still, not because he was fearless, but because he had accepted fear, then that was more powerful than any training she had ever known. The next evening, she followed him again. Daniel went to a small shelter behind the bookstore. There, children were eating warm soup. He knelt beside them, smiling, offering crackers and small stories from old books. The children laughed, and Accelera felt something stir in her chest. Was this leadership? Not through fear, not by force, but through kindness. She remembered the way her commanders yelled, punished, humiliated. She remembered the endless drills, the cold meals, the silence between warriors. Her whole life, she had believed power only came from strength. But this man, this simple human, showed something else. That night, when the children were asleep and the street was silent, Accelera stepped closer. She stood in the alley, barely 10 feet away. The cloak around her shifted. Daniel was sitting alone outside, staring at the stars. Then, without looking, he spoke. "You again." Accelera froze. How had he known? "I don't see you," Daniel continued softly. "But I feel you. Same feeling from the other night." Slowly, she uncloaked. He turned his head slightly, saw her standing in the darkness. He didn't run. "Are you here to finish what you started?" he asked. Accelera took a step forward, unsure what to say. "No. I came to learn." Daniel raised an eyebrow. From me. She nodded. Slowly. You stood still in front of death. Why? Daniel thought for a moment. Then he patted the ground next to him. Sit. Might take a while. Hesitating, Salora finally sat down. Her armor clicked softly as she lowered herself beside him. I used to be afraid of everything, Daniel said. Loud noises, the dark, the idea of being alone. But after the war, after I lost my wife and son, fear changed. Salora stayed silent. Her heart was pounding. She didn't know why. You can't fear the same things once you've already lost the things that matter most, he whispered. So when you showed up with your shiny blade, it didn't scare me. Because I've already died. Inside. Salora looked at him. Then why help others? Daniel smiled faintly. Because I know how it feels to hurt, and because someone once helped me. I owe that kindness forward. She blinked slowly, her mind spinning. In my world, she said quietly, kindness is seen as a defect. Daniel nodded. Maybe that's why your world keeps fighting. She didn't reply. They sat in silence for a long time. Above them, stars blinked. Far above, her ship floated silently, waiting for her to return. But Salora didn't move. For the first time in her life, she didn't want to. And for the first time in her warrior heart, she felt something strange, soft, and warm growing inside her. She didn't have a word for it. Not yet. But she knew. It started with this human. He finally spoke, and her mind broke. Salora returned the next night. This time, she didn't hide in shadows. She didn't bring weapons. She didn't cloak her presence. She just stood there, tall, armored, glowing faintly under the streetlight, watching the man who had broken everything she thought she knew. Daniel was sitting on the bench outside the bookstore again. He didn't even look surprised. He had 2 cups of tea sitting beside him. He picked one up and held it out. You came back, he said. Good. I made enough tea for 2. Salora hesitated. She had been offered wine by warlords, blood by rebels, victory medals by emperors, but never tea. She took the cup in her armored hand. It looked small, fragile. Daniel sipped his. Careful, it's hot. She mimicked him. The taste was strange, not unpleasant. Warm, sweet, a little bitter at the end. Like earth itself. They sat quietly for a few minutes. Finally, Salora turned to him. What you said the other night, about fear, about loss, it made no sense to me. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just stared at the stars. They were quiet tonight, peaceful, as if the whole sky was listening. Everything I was taught, she continued, says you should have begged for your life. You should have run, fought, screamed, but you just stood there. Daniel let out a slow breath. Because I already faced death, he said. And it didn't take me. Not then. Not now. Salora studied his face. No anger, no pride. Just calm sadness. I don't understand, she said. You were unarmed, alone, and yet you looked me in the eye like you were in control. Daniel gave a small smile. Control is a funny word, he said. You don't always need power to have it. Salora's fingers curled around the teacup. Explain. Daniel looked at her. His eyes were tired, but steady. When I was younger, he began, I thought bravery meant fighting, pushing back, winning at any cost. Salora nodded. That made sense. That was her world. But then the war came. I was drafted, sent across the sea. I saw cities burn. I saw people scream. I saw friends bleed out in my arms. And I learned something. He paused. Salora leaned in slightly. I learned that real courage is not about killing or surviving. It's about choosing who you become, even when everything inside you is broken. She felt something tighten in her chest. Daniel continued. After I lost my wife and son in a bombing, I wanted to disappear. I didn't eat, didn't sleep. For months, I just sat in a dark room. He took another sip of tea, his hand trembling just slightly. One day, a man I barely knew knocked on my door. He didn't say much, just left a small plant and a book. On the note he wrote, "If you're still breathing, there's still a chance to grow." Zelera was silent. Daniel's voice softened. That tiny act, it saved me. Not all at once, but slowly. So now, I try to pass it on. One small kindness at a time. Because you never know who's standing on the edge. Zelera blinked slowly. No training simulation prepared her for this. No weapon could fight these words. Your species, she said quietly, chooses kindness after pain. Daniel nodded. Some do. Others don't. We all have choices. She looked away, her mind spinning. Her whole life, she was told the enemy must be crushed. That fear creates order. That mercy creates chaos. But this man showed her the opposite, and it shook her more than any weapon ever could. Do you hate us? She asked suddenly. Daniel looked surprised. Aliens? She nodded. He shook his head. I don't hate. I'm too tired for that. But I fear for you. Fear for us. Yes, he said gently. Because if your people don't learn what kindness feels like, they'll destroy themselves long before they destroy us. His words were soft, not a threat, not a warning, just truth. And that's what made it hit so hard. Zelera stood up slowly, her armor clicking as she moved. Her chest felt heavy, confused, awake. I was bred for war, she said. Made in a lab, trained since childhood. I've never known kindness. Daniel looked at her, his eyes kind but steady. Then maybe, now's a good time to start. She didn't answer, couldn't. Instead, she turned and walked into the darkness. But unlike before, she didn't vanish completely. She paused near the alley and looked back. Daniel didn't move. He just raised his cup slightly, a silent goodbye. Zelera returned to her ship in silence. The halls felt colder. The voices felt louder. The commands harsher. She sat alone in her chamber, replaying his words again and again. Something had cracked inside her, and something new was trying to grow. Later that night, back on Earth, Daniel sat alone under the stars. He held the empty cup in his hands and looked up at the sky. Come back soon, he whispered softly. You're not broken, just unfinished. He didn't know if she could hear him. But somewhere in orbit, Zelera sat in her dark chamber, staring at the small teacup she had kept. And for the first time in her life, she felt like crying, but she didn't know how. The warrior starts to change, and her own people notice. The stars above Earth look different to Zelera now. They used to feel like cold points of light, far away and lifeless. But after meeting Daniel, they looked softer, like memories, like possibilities. Back aboard her ship, the Vraction, Zelera walked the long, silver corridors in silence. Soldiers saluted her. Drones floated past. Her officers gave reports. But she barely heard them. Her mind was stuck on that man. His voice, his stillness, his pain, his peace, and most of all, his choice to be kind, even after everything. That idea had begun to spread through her body like a slow fire, and without realizing it, she had started to change. Signs of change. The first sign was during a training session with new warriors. A young Zelvan soldier missed a strike in combat drills and tripped. Usually, the punishment would be swift, a shock, a strike, or a harsh word. But Zelera just looked at him. He waited for pain, but it never came. Instead, she said softly, "Get up. Try again." Everyone froze. No one had ever heard General Zelera say those words before. Later in the briefing room, she skipped the usual war chants. She gave shorter orders. She dismissed praise from her sub-commanders. When asked about her mission on Earth, she lied. The humans are weak, not worth the effort. But inside, she knew that was false. They weren't weak. At least not him. He was stronger than any war machine she had seen, because he didn't need to fight to be powerful. I start watching. Commander Virex, her second in command, noticed. He was sharp, loyal to the Empire, and dangerous. After one meeting, he approached her privately. "You've changed, Xelora," he said, his eyes narrow. "You hesitate. You speak softer. You no longer seek glory." Xelora looked at him, her face unreadable. "Is that a problem?" Virex didn't smile. "Yes, because softness leads to death. You taught us that yourself." She didn't respond. He leaned in closer. "What happened on Earth?" Xelora's fingers twitched slightly. She lied again. "Nothing important." But Virex didn't believe her. That night, he sent a stealth drone to Earth. His mission was simple: find out what touched Xelora's heart and destroy it. Back on Earth, Daniel didn't know he was being watched. He spent his days at the bookstore, helping the old owner fix a broken heater. He made warm soup for the shelter kids. He added extra pages to the stories he told, new tales about alien warriors and gentle monsters who chose to love instead of fight. Each story, in a strange way, was about Xelora, but he never said her name. He didn't know if she'd come back, but he hoped. Each night, he left a second cup of tea on the bench, and each morning, it was empty. The confrontation. Xelora finally returned, 5 nights later. She didn't come from the sky. She walked, quietly, in a dark cloak. No armor, no weapons, just herself. Daniel was waiting. "You missed the story hour," he said, smiling gently. "I've been busy," she replied. They sat again, side by side. This time, she held the cup before he offered it. A small change, but it meant something. "I think I'm breaking," she whispered. "No," Daniel said. "You're becoming." She turned to him, eyes sharp and tired. "In my world, emotions are poison. We were designed to serve, not feel. My choices have already made me a danger to them. They're watching me." Daniel grew quiet. "Then you need to be careful." "It's too late for that," she said. "What will they do? Kill me? Or worse, remove my memories? Reset me?" Daniel stared at her, a sadness in his eyes. "You're not a machine, Xelora. You're more than they think. They made me. But you are remaking yourself." Silence. The stars twinkled above them, unaware of the war brewing in her heart. The test. 2 nights later, the test came. Xelora was summoned by High Command. A target had been identified. A human male. No military value, no protection. Just one man. Xelora's mission: eliminate him publicly to show that fear still ruled Earth. She knew the name before it even came up on the screen. Daniel Carter. Her breath caught. They knew, and they were watching to see what she'd do next. Commander Virex stood in the control room, his face calm. He was testing her. One wrong move, and she would be branded a traitor. "Begin strike preparations," he said. Xelora's hands shook slightly. She reached for the console, then stopped. "No." The room froze. Virex turned slowly. "What did you say?" Xelora looked up, her voice stronger now. "I said no. I will not kill him. You dare disobey a direct order. I will not destroy something I admire." Virex's voice dropped low. "You've gone soft." Xelora stepped forward. "No, I've gone strong, because now I see what strength really is." "Then you leave us no choice." Alarms blared. Guards stepped forward. Xelora didn't run. She activated her armor and leaped through the wall of the ship, crashing through steel and glass, diving into the night sky toward Earth like a falling comet. Back to Daniel. Daniel was walking home from the shelter when he saw the sky light up. A streak of red and silver blazed across the stars. She had returned. But this time, not for tea. She landed hard, leaving a crater in the street. People screamed and ran. But Daniel stood still. She walked to him, breathless, glowing faintly, armor sparking. "They're coming," she said. "For both of us." Daniel nodded. "Then let's not hide. You may die. That's not the worst thing." "Then what is?" Daniel looked at her. "Dying without doing what's right." Celera stared at him. For a moment, the world disappeared, and she made her choice. "Then we stand together. The invasion begins, but she's not ready to let go." The clouds above New Avalon turned black, unnaturally black. It wasn't rain. It was war. Thousands of people stared at the sky as giant alien ships broke through Earth's upper atmosphere. Red streaks glowed behind them like fire in the night. Buildings shook. Alarms rang. Satellites fell silent. The invasion had begun. But for General Celera, it didn't feel like a victory. She stood on the rooftop of Daniel's bookstore, her armor barely holding together after her escape from the command ship. Sparks flew from one of her shoulder plates. Her breathing was heavy, shallow. Inside her, everything was torn between what she was taught and what she now believed. Next to her stood Daniel, calm, quiet, watching the sky, the same way he had watched her the first time they met. "It's starting," he said. Celera nodded. "They will burn your cities. They will not stop until this planet is ash." "Then why warn me? Why not join them?" Her voice cracked, just slightly. "Because I'm not them anymore." Daniel turned to her, eyes calm. "What are you then?" Celera looked at her trembling hands. "I don't know yet, but I think I want to be something else." The first strike. Above them, the Zelvan fleet opened fire. Red beams lit up the night as the first line of human defenses, a mix of jets and missile systems, rose to meet them. The fight was one-sided. Earth's weapons were outdated, slow, and scattered. In less than 7 minutes, 2 major power grids were knocked out. Satellites exploded mid-orbit. Communication towers fell like dominoes. People screamed and ran. But Daniel stood still. Celera saw it again, that same stillness that had first shaken her soul. "You still don't run," she whispered, "because fear doesn't help the people who need me." Her eyes stung. She looked away. "I want to help, but if I fight them, they'll brand me a traitor." "Aren't you already one?" Daniel asked gently. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. A dangerous choice. Back on the main Zelvan command ship, Commander Virex watched the battle unfold. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "She hasn't returned," he said. "General Celera has gone rogue," one officer replied. Virex narrowed his eyes. "Then bring her down, and anyone standing beside her." The people began to notice. In the streets of New Avalon, chaos was everywhere. People ran through smoke. Children cried. The police had no orders. The military was cut off. And then something strange happened. A woman pointed at the sky and screamed, "Look." There she was. Celera, floating in the sky, armor flickering, eyes glowing, but not firing. She wasn't attacking the humans. She was protecting them. With a burst of blue energy, she deflected a drone beam that would have hit a hospital. Then another, and another. She flew fast, blocking attacks, covering civilians, even leading families into safety under the bookstore. Word spread fast. "One of them is helping us. She saved my brother." The aliens fighting for Earth. People didn't know her name, but they saw her actions. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change a heart. Daniel's stand. Inside the bookstore, Daniel helped an old woman who had fallen. He carried a boy on his back down into the basement. He handed out flashlights, comforted people, and made space for more. But his eyes always returned to the stairs, waiting to see if she was still out there. Still standing. still choosing them. The fight gets personal. Zelra was midair when a sharp blast hit her side. She tumbled through a building wall, landing in a shower of broken glass and concrete. Pain screamed through her body. She looked up. Commander Virex stood above her, lowering his weapon. "You disappoint me," he said coldly. "I made a choice," Zelra replied, forcing herself up. "You were the best of us. Then why do I finally feel alive?" He didn't answer. He just attacked. The fight was brutal. Steel clashed against energy. Walls crumbled. Sparks flew. Virex was stronger, sharper, faster. But Zelra had something he didn't. A reason to fight beyond orders. A city watches. Hundreds of people watched the battle from behind broken windows and phone screens. They didn't cheer. They didn't scream. They simply watched, their eyes wide, hearts pounding. For the first time in human history, a war between aliens wasn't about planets or power. It was about a choice. One warrior standing against her own kind, for the people she used to see as weak. Daniel runs toward the danger. Smoke covered the street as the bookstore caught fire. Daniel coughed, pulling children out, guiding elders with a flashlight. Then he saw her. Zelra, on her knees, sparks flying from her back. Virex was about to strike again. And Daniel ran. No hesitation. No plan. Just a librarian with a burned sweater and tired legs, running straight toward a battle between warriors from another galaxy. He picked up a broken piece of rebar from the ground. "Hey," he shouted. Virex turned, almost amused. You're not welcome here." Virex laughed. Zelra looked up, stunned. "Daniel, get back." But he didn't stop. He stood between her and Virex. "She made a choice, and I'm making mine." Virex raised his weapon. But Zelra rose faster. With one last surge of power, she launched forward, slamming into Virex with all her strength, sending both of them crashing into a nearby tower. The sky goes silent. A few seconds later, the Zelvan fleet above stopped firing. They had seen the battle. They had seen their top commander fall. They had seen their war hero rise against them, and the people she had chosen to protect. Some ships broke formation. Some retreated. Others just hovered, confused. And Earth watched, breathless. She fell from the sky. Zelra came falling through the clouds, her armor burnt, her body limp. Daniel caught her as best he could, falling to the ground with her weight. "Hey," he said, touching her face gently. "You're not done yet." Her eyes blinked open, weak but glowing. Did I protect them?" she whispered. "Yes," he said. "You did more than that." She smiled faintly. "I didn't let go." She defies them all, and pays the price. The world held its breath. The fire in the skies had faded, but the silence that followed was heavy, thick with fear, wonder, and something no one could explain. Hope. In the middle of the street, where only hours ago people ran in panic, now they stood still, watching a broken alien warrior lying in the arms of a human librarian. Not a weapon anymore. Zelra's armor was cracked and smoking. Her breathing was shallow. One eye flickered, damaged by Virex's final strike. Her energy source was failing. She could feel it. Daniel held her gently, whispering her name again and again, like a prayer he didn't know he believed in. "Stay with me," he said, voice tight. "I tried," she gasped. "You did more than try." She looked up at him, blinking slowly. "I was made to destroy." "No," he whispered, his eyes wet. "You were made to choose, and you chose us." The response from the sky. Above, the Zelvan fleet hovered uncertainly. High Command had seen the broadcast. Drones had streamed every second of her battle with Commander Virex, her refusal to obey, her protection of humans, her final blow that brought down a commander once thought unbeatable. Some ships pulled back. Others began charging weapons, but none fired. They waited. General Xelera, a voice echoed through her damaged communicator. This is Supreme Officer Zern. You are hereby declared a traitor. Surrender immediately or be erased. Daniel looked around, fear growing. People were still gathered. Soldiers had begun to arrive. Helicopters circled overhead. Earth had noticed. And so had the galaxy. The broadcast that changed everything. A camera drone belonging to a civilian news network hovered quietly, recording everything. And Xelera saw it. She pushed herself up, slowly, painfully. Daniel tried to hold her, but she shook her head. I need to stand. He helped her. She stood in front of the drone, blood on her lips, armor falling apart, but eyes glowing with something pure, something stronger than any weapon. To the Zelvan Empire, she said, her voice weak but unbroken. I have no apology. I was made in your labs, raised in your war camps. I followed your orders without question. I destroyed worlds for you. But I met one man, one human, who didn't fight me, didn't fear me. He offered me tea. And that small act broke everything I thought was true. People around her listened in silence. You told me mercy was weakness, but I've never felt stronger than I do right now. You told me love is a lie, but I see it in these people, in their kindness, their courage, their pain. I will not return to you. I will not follow your path. I choose my own. She turned to the camera one last time. I am not your weapon anymore. I am free. The feed cut. The price of defiance. In orbit, the command ship moved into position. Zern's voice came again. Cold. Empty. General Xelera. Last chance. Surrender or be terminated. Daniel stepped in front of her. If she dies, you'll only prove her right. No reply. Then, without warning, the sky split open. A massive beam of light, white-hot and roaring, fired down toward them. People screamed. Some ran. Others froze. Daniel wrapped himself around Xelera, trying to shield her with his body. She tried to push him away, but he held firm. There was no time to move. No place to run. The light consumed everything. Silence. A crater appeared where they had stood. Smoke filled the streets. Dust rose in thick clouds. The force shook buildings and cracked the earth. For a moment, the whole world went quiet. Then, a sound. A slow, heavy cough. From the smoke, a figure emerged. Broken, burned, barely standing. Xelera. She had taken the full force of the blast. Her armor completely melted, one arm hanging limp, metal fused to skin. Daniel was still breathing, barely wrapped in her other arm. She had shielded him. Even in the end, she chose to protect. The world reacts. People rushed forward. Not soldiers, not medics, just people. A young girl ran with water. A man tore off his jacket to cover her burns. Another man dropped to his knees beside her, pressing a shaking hand to her pulse. And Daniel, he opened his eyes. You're here, he whispered. I didn't let go, she said, smiling faintly. The moment was captured by every camera still working. The galaxy watched it unfold, this act of defiance, of sacrifice, of connection between two beings from different worlds. The message spread faster than any war broadcast before. Rebellion in the ranks. On the command ship, Zern stared at the feed. Something unexpected happened. Some of his officers began to remove their badges. One turned and said quietly, "She showed more honor in 1 hour than we have in a lifetime." Zern barked orders, but fewer hands moved. Ships started to drift. Some shut down their weapons. Others turned around completely. And just like that, the invasion ended. The aftermath. Xelera lay in a medical tent, surrounded by doctors and human engineers trying to understand her body. She was in pain, constant pain, but she was awake. Daniel sat beside her. His hand never left hers. "You paid the price," he said. "And it was worth it," she whispered. The door opened. A high-ranking Earth official stepped in. "You're the reason we're alive," she said softly. "The world owes you." Celdra shook her head. "No, just give the world a chance to be better than we were." A new mission. Weeks passed. The Zelvan Empire fractured. Many ships left. Some surrendered. Some joined Earth in peace talks. And Celdra. She recovered slowly. She walked with a limp now. Her voice was softer. Her armor was gone. But her spirit? It had never burned brighter. She began speaking. At schools, at peace councils, at healing centers. People listened. Because she had lived her truth and paid the price to protect it. One last walk. One evening, Celdra and Daniel walked along the river. She had a new suit, half Earth-made, half Zelvan tech. It clicked softly as she walked, but she didn't mind. "Still think kindness is weakness?" Daniel teased. Celdra smirked. "No, kindness broke my entire empire." "And you?" She stopped walking, looked at him. "Kindness made me whole." He took her hand. The stars above twinkled silently. And for the first time, neither of them felt alone in the universe. She understood his courage because she found her own. The world had changed. The skies above New Avalon were no longer filled with fire. The streets once shaken by fear now carried the quiet hum of rebuilding. Broken glass had been swept. Craters had been patched. Burned homes were being repainted by strangers working side by side. And in the middle of it all stood a former alien general who once believed kindness was a defect. Celdra. Now, people smiled when they saw her. Children waved. Some even ran to her, asking if they could touch the glowing lines on her new armor. She wasn't just known. She was trusted. Not because she had power, but because she had chosen not to use it when it mattered most. The ceremony. A month after the invasion ended, Earth held a ceremony at the United Nations Assembly. It wasn't just for leaders. It wasn't only for speeches. It was for the people. Hundreds gathered from every continent. Diplomats, survivors, doctors, soldiers, even former Zelvan rebels who had defected during the final days. And at the center of the stage was Daniel. He didn't like public speaking. He never had. But today he stood straight, a slight nervous smile on his face as he stepped up to the mic. "Most of you know me as the man who served tea to an alien." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. "But I didn't do it to be brave. I wasn't trying to make peace. I didn't even understand what was happening that night. I did it because someone once did something kind for me when I needed it. And that small act saved my life." He paused. "I just wanted to pass that on. I didn't expect that one cup of tea would stop a war." The crowd went quiet. "And I didn't expect that the fiercest warrior in the galaxy would become one of Earth's greatest protectors." People turned as Celdra stepped forward, limping slightly, her head held high. She stood beside Daniel, looking at the crowd not with dominance, but peace. Applause followed. Not forced, not formal, but real. Later that night, they sat together on the bookstore roof, just like old times. 2 cups of tea between them, a blanket over their legs. The city twinkled beneath them like a quiet sea of stars. "You were brave up there," Celdra said, sipping carefully. "I nearly fainted." She smiled. "Still brave." He looked at her. "You know, I never asked. What would have happened if you hadn't stopped Virex that night?" She was silent for a moment. "I would have lost myself. Forever. And now I'm finally free. But not because I disobeyed them." "Then why?" She turned toward him. "Because I found my own courage, not in battle, not in orders, but in you, in your silence, in your tea, in your truth." Daniel looked at her, heart swelling. You always had it, Xelra. You just needed someone to remind you. She nodded slowly. And I want to remind others. A new mission. Xelra began traveling, not with weapons, but with words. She visited Zelvan war orphans raised in training camps. She sat beside old enemies and told them her story. She went to places where people had only known conquest and gave them hope instead. She became a voice for those caught between two worlds. Half warrior, half human in heart. The School of Peace. 1 year later, she helped open the first human Zelvan Peace Institute just outside New Avalon. The design was a mix of Earth architecture and Zelvan technology. Simple, glowing lines flowing through stone walls, gardens with fruit from both planets, and a library in the center. At the front gate stood a statue, not of soldiers, but of two people sitting with cups of tea. No weapons, no armor. Just a conversation. The last letter. One day, Daniel found a letter tucked between pages in a book she had given him long ago. It read, "I never told you what I feared most. It wasn't death. It wasn't even failure. It was being seen and still unloved. But you saw me, broken, confused, dangerous, and you still stayed. You didn't just give me tea. You gave me a second chance at life. And I'll spend the rest of mine passing that gift on." He folded the letter slowly and placed it close to his heart. Then walked outside to where she stood, teaching a small group of children how to use peaceful tech to build shelters. She turned, sensing him. "You read it." "I did." "And?" He smiled. "I'm still here." She smiled too. And in that moment, there were no species, no sides, no past. Just two souls who changed everything by choosing kindness in a world built on fear. Her final choice. Years later, when the galaxy was on the brink again, when old leaders rose and new threats whispered from the stars, Xelra was asked to return to battle, to command again, to be the weapon once more. And she refused, but not with anger. She simply stood before the council and said, "You keep asking me to fight, but I already won. I defeated the fear inside me. I chose to see the enemy not as a threat, but as someone who once needed help. And that is the greatest courage I will ever carry." Then she bowed, not in shame, but in peace. Legacy. Stories of General Xelra were told across generations, in songs, in books, in memory. But not because of her victories, because of her choices, and because of one quiet human who stood still when the universe expected him to run. Old Daniel sat by the river one evening, legs crossed, watching the sun dip beneath the water's edge. A shadow landed beside him. He didn't need to look. "Took you long enough," he whispered. Xelra, older, still strong, now marked by time, sat down beside him. Galaxies move slow. He handed her a cup of tea. Still hot, still perfect. They watched the sunset. Together. No battles left to fight. No pain left to carry. Just peace. Because now, she understood his courage. Because now, she had found her own.